15 points. That is how many conditions the United States of America, the most powerful military in human history, 26 days into the most intense air campaign since the Iraq invasion, with 13 soldiers dead and $200 billion requested from Congress, needed to write down on a piece of paper and send through Pakistan to end a war it started. 15 points. Delivered not through a diplomatic channel, not through an embassy, not through the kind of direct engagement that two countries conduct when they are serious about resolving a conflict. Through Pakistan, because the United States and Iran have no direct channel, because Israel has vowed to keep killing Iranian officials as fast as they can be replaced, because the last time Iran was in high-level talks with an American administration, the bombs fell while the diplomats were still in the room. Iran read all 15 points, called them maximalist and unreasonable. And on Wednesday, March 25th, 2026, while the ink on the American proposal was still conceptually wet, Iranian drones set Kuwait International Airport on fire. Saudi Arabia shot down 8 Iranian drones over its oil-rich eastern province. Missile alert sirens sounded in Bahrain, and Iran's foreign minister went on state television and said something that 17 words cannot fully contain. He said, "We have not engaged in talks to end the war, and we do not plan on any negotiations. Not we have concerns about the proposal. Not we need clarification on certain points. Not we are interested in negotiation, but require confidence-building measures first. We do not plan on any negotiations." Present tense, deliberate, in English. For the same audience that had just spent 48 hours being told by the White House that talks were productive, that a deal was possible, that the president was confident, that Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner and Marco Rubio and J.D. Vance were all working on it. Iran then issued its own counterproposal. 4 conditions, not 15. 4. And those 4 conditions tell you more about where this war actually ends than every press briefing combined. Iran wants a permanent halt to the killing of its officials. It wants legally binding guarantees that no future war will be waged against it. It wants war reparations, and it wants its sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz formally recognized. Read that last one again. Iran wants the international community to formally recognize that the waterway through which 20% of global oil flows belongs to Iran. Not shared, not internationalized, not governed by freedom of navigation principles, sovereign Iranian territory, with Iran deciding who passes, under what conditions, at what price. America's 15 demands and Iran's 4 counter-demands do not overlap. They do not partially intersect. They are not a starting point for negotiation. They are a complete and documented map of the gap that must be closed before this war ends. And that gap is the most important fact that has emerged in 26 days of conflict. More important than the casualty count, more important than the oil price, more important than the missile exchange rate. The gap is not a communications problem. It is not a trust deficit that can be bridged by a mediator's goodwill. It is a structural incompatibility between what America needs to call this a victory and what Iran needs to call it the same thing. And both of those things cannot simultaneously be true. If you think what happened Wednesday, the rejected proposal, the counter-demands, the Kuwait airport fire, the Israel airstrikes on Tehran, and Iran's missiles landing in apartment buildings in Israeli cities, is a negotiating process unfolding toward a resolution, you are about to understand exactly why that assumption does not survive contact with the 15 points and the 4. Because this is not a story about a negotiation. It is a story about a gap, about why that gap exists, about who created it and when, and about the specific pattern that every expert who has studied American conflict resolution in the last 70 years can identify by name because they have seen it before. Not once, not twice, every single time. By the end of this video, you will understand 3 things. First, what the 15 American points and the 4 Iranian counter-demands actually reveal about what each side considers non-negotiable, and why the specific items on each list were predictable before this war started. Second, the pattern. The documented sequence that explains not just how we arrived at a 15 versus 4 standoff on day 26, but why this specific standoff was the only possible outcome of the theory of victory that the administration started this war with. And third, what this means for you, for the oil price, for the paratroopers being deployed, for the $200 billion bill, and for the question of what comes after a negotiation that both sides entered with conditions the other cannot meet. To understand the full weight of what Wednesday revealed, you have to go back not to February 28th, when the bombs fell, but to the negotiating history that preceded it. Because the specific items on the 15-point American plan were not invented after the war started. They are the same items that Iran refused to negotiate before the war started. And the specific items on Iran's 4-point counterplan are the same items that America refused to grant before the war started. The 15-point American plan, as described by Pakistani officials who transmitted it, addresses sanctions relief, a rollback of Iran's nuclear program, limits on Iran's ballistic missile arsenal, the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, and restrictions on Iran's support for armed groups across the region. Every single one of those 5 categories was on the American demand list before February 28th. In the negotiations that preceded the war, in the back channels running through Oman, in the conversations that Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner were conducting in the weeks before the bombs fell, Iran's answer to those demands before the war was the same as Iran's answer to them now, not negotiable. Iran will not discuss its ballistic missile program. Iran will not discuss its support for regional armed groups. Iran will not discuss its control over the Strait of Hormuz. These are, in Iran's framing, the architecture of its national security, the tools through which a country of 90 million people with no formal military alliance defends itself against neighbors that have invaded it twice in 40 years, and a superpower that has attacked it twice under the same presidential administration. The war did not change Iran's position, it hardened it, because the war provided the evidence that Iran's security doctrine was correct, that without those missiles, without those proxies, without that chokehold on the strait, Iran would have been destroyed in the opening days of the campaign rather than still standing, still firing, still issuing counter-proposals on day 26. Iran's 4 counter-demands tell the same story from the other direction. Formal sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz was not in Iran's pre-war public position. The war created that demand. The bombing of Iran's navy, the destruction of its conventional military assets, the assassination of its supreme leader, its foreign minister's statement that the strait will never return to its pre-war status, all of that created the conditions under which claiming formal sovereignty over Hormuz is Iran's rational response. You destroyed our navy. You killed our leader. You spent $15 billion a week bombing our country. In exchange, we want formal recognition that the waterway you need costs access on our terms. The war reparations demand did not exist before February 28th. Over 1,500 Iranians are dead. Over 1 million Lebanese have been displaced. The bill for the destruction of Iranian infrastructure runs into hundreds of billions of dollars. War reparations are what countries that have been bombed demand when the bombing stops. They were always going to be on the list. The guarantee against future war is the demand that reveals the deepest structural problem. Iran has now been attacked twice under the same American administration, twice while in diplomatic contact with that administration, twice with the stated goal of ending the talks rather than continuing them. The legal guarantee Iran is requesting, the binding international commitment that America will not attack again, is the one guarantee that no American president can sign because no American president can bind their successor or their own future judgment. It is simultaneously Iran's most legitimate demand and America's most impossible concession. Now let me show you the pattern, because what happened Wednesday was not surprising to anyone who had been watching the documented sequence that this war has followed from the beginning. I call it the escalation to negotiation trap. It has 4 stages. It has played out the same way in every major American military engagement in the last 60 years, always in the same sequence, always producing the same structural outcome. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it in the 15-point plan or in Iran's 4-point counter-demand. Stage 1 is the theory of victory. A military campaign is launched with a specific theory of how the other side will respond. The theory assumes that sufficient force will produce either compliance or collapse. In Iran's case, the theory was that decapitation of the leadership, destruction of the missile infrastructure, and the economic pressure of the Hormuz blockade reversing back onto Iran would produce either a popular uprising or leadership calculation that surrender was preferable to continued destruction. The theory was stated clearly and repeatedly. It was wrong. Stage 2 is the persistence problem. The other side does not comply or collapse on the theory's schedule. Instead, they adapt, they disperse assets, they change tactics, they absorb the initial shock and establish a sustainable pace of resistance. Iran fired 700 missiles from decade-old inventory in the opening weeks. It has been rationing its advanced systems since. It has maintained sufficient attack capacity to keep the Strait of Hormuz commercially unusable for 26 days. It has struck energy infrastructure in 4 Gulf nations simultaneously. It has continued operations against Israel while managing a war against the most advanced air force in history. The persistence problem arrived, as it always does, faster than the theory of victory predicted. Stage 3 is the negotiation announcement. When the theory of victory fails on its own timeline, the pressure to negotiate increases from multiple directions simultaneously. Economic pain reverses back onto the attacking country. Allies express concern. Congressional voices begin asking questions. The political calendar asserts itself. The administration announces that negotiations are underway, that progress is being made, that a deal is possible. The announcement is made before the deal exists, because the announcement itself is designed to create the political space that allows the deal to be constructed. The 15-point plan transmitted through Pakistan was not the beginning of a negotiation. It was the announcement of one. Whether the negotiation itself can follow is the question that Wednesday's rejection answered. Stage 4 is the gap confrontation. The gap between what the attacking party needs from the deal and what the defending party will accept is documented in public, not in a classified negotiation room. In the open, both sides state their positions. The positions do not overlap. The gap between them is the structural reality of the conflict. The specific questions that the military campaign was supposed to resolve and did not now return to the diplomatic table, with the defending party in a stronger position than when the bombs started falling, because the defending party is still standing, and the attacking party needs the deal more urgently than the defending party does. Let me verify this pattern. 3 examples, all documented, all following the same sequence. Example 1, Korea, 1950 to 1953. The Korean War began with an American theory that a sufficient military response would restore the pre-war line and deter further aggression. By late 1950, with Chinese forces having entered the conflict, the theory had failed. The war entered a stalemate. Negotiations began in July 1951. They continued for 2 years while the fighting continued simultaneously. The gap between the American position on prisoner repatriation and the Chinese and North Korean position was documented, argued over, and ultimately resolved at a cost of 54,000 American lives across the negotiating period. The specific issues on the negotiating table in 1953 were the same issues that had been deemed non-negotiable by both sides in 1951. The gap did not close through logic. It closed through exhaustion. The question is always, which side exhausts first? Example 2. Vietnam, 1969 to 1973. The Paris Peace Accords that ended direct American involvement in Vietnam were negotiated over 4 years. The specific terms of the final agreement, the positioning of North Vietnamese forces in the South, the status of the DMZ, the political framework for a unified Vietnam, were terms that both sides had publicly declared unacceptable at the beginning of the negotiating process. The agreement was reached not because the gap closed, but because both sides concluded that continued fighting cost more than accepting terms they had previously rejected. The 15-point American plan for Iran and the 4-point Iranian counter-demand are the opening declarations of a gap-closing process whose timeline is determined entirely by who runs out of willingness to continue first. Example 3. The 2015 Iran nuclear deal itself. The JCPOA that Trump spent 2 terms denouncing was negotiated over 2 years. Its final terms were preceded by repeated declarations from both sides that specific items were non-negotiable. Iran said repeatedly it would not cap enrichment below a level consistent with a functioning civilian nuclear program. The United States said repeatedly it would not accept any enrichment capacity. The final agreement accepted Iranian enrichment at reduced levels with inspection protocols. Both sides accepted terms they had declared unacceptable, because both sides calculated that the alternative was worse. The 15-point plan and the 4-point counter-demand are the latest version of a negotiating dynamic that both sides have experienced before. The question is not whether the gap can close. It closed before in 2015. The question is what it costs to close it this time, and who pays that cost. 3 examples, 3 conflicts, same pattern, same sequence, same gap-closing mechanism. Now let me tell you what comes next. The 15-point plan contains items that Israel considers non-negotiable in the opposite direction from Iran. America's plan calls for restricting Iran's support for regional armed groups. This means Hezbollah. This means the militias in Iraq and Syria and Yemen that represent Israel's primary concern about the deal. Any deal that leaves those groups intact is, from Israel's perspective, a deal that recreates the threat environment that preceded October 7th, 2023. Israel has not authorized America to negotiate a deal that leaves those groups operational. Israel was, according to documented accounts, surprised that America submitted a ceasefire plan at all. The Israeli official community has been described as having advocated for Trump to continue the war. A former Israeli ambassador used the word duped to describe Trump's original entry into the conflict, which means the 15-point American plan is not just opposed by Iran. It faces opposition from America's ally whose advocacy shaped the war and whose agreement is necessary for any deal to hold. The gap is not between 2 parties. It is between 3 positions. And 3-way gaps are structurally harder to close than 2-way gaps, because satisfying 2 parties always creates a new gap with the third. Iran's 4 counter-demands are equally constrained. Formal sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz is not something the United States government can grant. It would require rejecting freedom of navigation principles that American foreign policy has defended for 70 years. It would require accepting that a hostile government controls access to the shipping lane that carries 20% of global oil. It would require acknowledging, formally and legally, that the war produced an outcome that America cannot describe publicly as a victory. Every ally in Asia that depends on Middle Eastern oil, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, would read that concession as an American withdrawal from the security architecture they depend on. It is the demand that exposes the full ambition of what Iran has been building toward. Not just ending this war, ending the strategic environment that made this war possible. Now let me tell you what this means for you, specifically today. First, the 5-day pause is not a ceasefire, and Wednesday confirmed it. Oil markets briefly fell on the news of a potential deal. Oil went back up when Iran called the plan maximalist and unreasonable and set Kuwait's airport on fire. The price of oil is not being governed by military events anymore. It is being governed by the distance between 15 points and 4 counterdemands. And that distance is, as of Wednesday evening, unresolved and widening. Do not plan your household budget around an oil price normalization that requires closing a gap that both sides just publicly declared incompatible. Second, the 82nd Airborne Paratroopers being deployed are a specific signal that goes beyond general reinforcement. Paratroopers are trained for one primary mission: seizing airfields and key territory in contested areas. Their deployment is not a defensive measure. It is a capability addition for an operation that requires entry into a location that does not have established friendly access. The question of what operation requires paratroopers in the Middle East right now has one visible answer: Karg Island, an island 15 miles off the Iranian coast, the facility that processes the majority of Iran's oil exports, the facility that Trump has been discussing since 1988, the facility that every analysis of the war's endgame identifies as the option of last resort before ground forces are considered. The paratroopers are not arriving because the negotiation is going well. Third, Iran's counterproposal was not designed to be accepted. It was designed to be documented. Iran's 4 conditions are calibrated to be impossible for America to accept in their current form, which means Iran can continue the war while appearing to have extended a good faith offer that the other side rejected. The counterproposal is a political document. It establishes for the historical record that Iran sought an end to the conflict on terms that the aggressor refused. That framing matters enormously for how this war is discussed in the United Nations, in the international community, and in the domestic politics of every country whose population is paying elevated energy prices because of a conflict they did not vote for. Fourth, Israel's surprise at the ceasefire plan is the most operationally significant fact of Wednesday. An ally that was not consulted on a ceasefire proposal transmitted to the common enemy, that continues striking that enemy while the proposal is being considered, that has publicly stated it will continue killing the enemy's leadership regardless of any negotiating process, is not an ally coordinating toward the same outcome. The triangular gap between American, Israeli, and Iranian positions on what constitutes an acceptable end state is not a communications problem. It is a fundamental strategic misalignment between partners who entered this war with different goals and are now discovering that those goals cannot all be achieved in the same settlement. Fifth, the mediator framework matters more now than at any previous point in this war. Egypt, Pakistan, and Turkey are the active channels. Oman is available but has reduced its role after previous approaches failed. Qatar is attempting mediation despite the destruction of its LNG facility. Each mediator has different relationships with each party and different incentives for a specific outcome. The specific country that produces a deal will have earned leverage with both Iran and America that shapes the geopolitics of the region for a decade. Watch which mediator gets the credit. The credit assignment tells you who extracted the most value from the process. Sixth, the death toll as documented on Wednesday is the clearest argument that the gap must close. Over 1,500 Iranians dead, over 1,100 Lebanese, 16 Israelis, 13 American military members, 80 Iraqi security forces, millions displaced. The human cost of the gap between 15 points and 4 counterdemands is being paid in those numbers every day that the gap remains unclosed. That arithmetic does not appear in oil price charts or bond yields. It appears in the morgues of 4 countries. The urgency of the mediators is not abstract. It is specifically calculated against a daily casualty rate that cannot be sustained politically by any of the governments involved indefinitely. Seventh, watch Friday. Mediators pushed publicly for in-person talks between Iranian and American representatives in Pakistan, perhaps as soon as Friday. Friday is the date now circled. Not because the gap will close in a single meeting, but because in-person talks produce a different dynamic than transmitted proposals. The 15-point plan was sent through Pakistan because there is no direct channel. If the direct channel opens in Islamabad on Friday, even for preliminary contact, even for an exchange of positions rather than a negotiation, the architecture of the conflict changes. The war does not end at a meeting in Pakistan on Friday. But a meeting in Pakistan on Friday would mean that Iran concluded that meeting was worth more than not meeting. That conclusion, if it occurs, is the most important signal of the war. If this breakdown changed how you see the 15 points and the 4 counterdemands, if the pattern that produced this standoff is now recognizable as the same pattern that produced every major American conflict resolution standoff in the last 70 years, subscribe to this channel now. drop a comment below. Tell me whether you think the paratroopers signal a Karg Island operation or a ceasefire escort mission. Tell me which of Iran's 4 counter-demands you think America is most likely to partially accept, and in what form. Tell me whether you think in-person talks in Pakistan change anything on Friday. I read every comment. The best ones shape the next video. Hit subscribe and the notification bell, because the next video is going to map what a deal that both sides can describe as a victory actually looks like. What America can grant without calling it sovereignty over Hormuz, what Iran can accept without calling it surrender on its missile program, what Israel can be given to stop opposing a settlement that does not achieve regime change, and what the historical record of every gap-closing deal in the last 70 years tells us about the specific concession that neither side announces publicly until the morning after the agreement is signed. The deal that ends this war will not look like what either side demanded on Wednesday. It will look like something that both sides can describe differently to their own audiences. That has always been how gaps close, not through one side capitulating, through both sides discovering language that lets them describe the same outcome differently. The 15-point plan is not that language. The 4 counter-demands are not that language. Somewhere between them, in a meeting room in Pakistan that may or may not happen on Friday, with mediators from 4 countries trying to find a formulation that both sides can describe as winning, the language is being searched for. The gap is documented. The pattern is recognizable. The clock is running, and the airport in Kuwait City is still on fire.